This is your tech news briefing for Friday, December 9th. I'm Zoe Thomas for the Wall Street Journal. Have you ever gotten in a car and looked up directions on Google Maps, only to then check Waze to see if it has a faster route? Well, you might not realize the two services are actually both owned by Google. The units have worked mostly separately since Google bought Waze in 2013. But this week, Google's parent company Alphabet said it plans to combine them. What's behind the change? And how will employees and users be affected? Joining me to talk through that is WSJ reporter Miles Kruppa, who covers all things Alphabet. Hi, Miles. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Zoe.
So what do we know about the reasons for combining Maps and Waze?
So for a long time, Maps and Waze have basically operated independently. And right now, we're in this moment where the economy is getting worse. Google is facing more pressure as advertising growth slows down. And recently, the Google CEO, Sundar Pichai, has been talking about how Google might need to reduce overlap in some products across the company. For instance, in the past, Google had Google Play Music and also YouTube Music, and they sort of brought those two things together. So Waze and Maps sort of seemed like a natural area of overlap to reduce. Google said some of the benefits from this move will be that the teams can work together on their map-making efforts. Some of these efforts were being duplicated across both Waze and Google Maps, and it doesn't make sense for those to be kept separate. So you could see it improving efficiency and potentially also improving costs down the line if they're able to find technical costs they can cut by being able to centralize some of the stuff in one organization.
What is this going to mean for the people who work in each of these units then?
So Google said there won't be any layoffs associated with this move, but Waze workers will be going to a new organization led by this executive, Chris Phillips, who leads Maps, Earth, Street View under this organization called Geo. So these people who used to work fairly separately on two products that were in some ways competing under the same roof are now going to be, I guess, in the same room together, not just under the same roof. The idea is that they'll be collaborating more on things like navigation, how to improve the user experience on both apps, and how to learn from both apps. But I have to think it's going to be just a little awkward since they're planning to keep Waze as its own standalone app, and clearly there are people who are devoted to one or the other.
You mentioned that people are devoted to one or the other. I mean, there is somewhat of a divide between people who use Google Maps to get around and people who swear by Waze to get around. So what is this combination going to mean for users of these apps?
So far, I think it will mean very little for the users. They plan to keep Waze as a separate app, a separate brand. You know, it will be interesting to see how the Waze community reacts to this because Waze maintains a very active community of basically unpaid freelancers who crowdsource data about traffic and are constantly updating the Waze navigation maps. So I'm sure people in the community will have thoughts about these team members now working with Google Maps.
Let's take a step back for a second. Google acquired Waze in 2013. Can you tell us a little bit about that combination over time?
Sure. So as you said, Google acquired Waze in 2013 for about $1.1 billion. It was a big acquisition for the company at the time. It drew some scrutiny from regulators worried that Google was basically eliminating its biggest competitor in Maps, but ultimately it was cleared. For the longest time, Waze was led by this CEO, Noam Bardin, who was sort of the face of the company, the charismatic leader, and based on my understanding, he did a good job of sort of protecting Waze within Google and trying to keep it as an independent thing. In 2021, he actually left the company and later said that he thought Waze probably could have grown faster as an independent company and kind of hid out at the Google bureaucracy. They brought in a new CEO last year. Neha Parikh plans to exit the organization after a transition period. The reason Google gave is that because Waze is no longer an independent organization, it does not need its own CEO. What's still unclear is whether Neha will stay with Google or Alphabet in some role. So we'll have to see where she lands.
Okay, so that's the change to Waze and to Google Maps, but as you mentioned, this is part of a bigger strategy for Alphabet to deal with cost cutting. I mean, do we expect to see more steps like this at the company?
Yeah, I think we will see more stuff like this. We've already seen Google kill Stadia, which was its cloud streaming gaming service. We've seen it make cuts at an internal incubator called Area 120. So far, it's sort of small stuff around the edges, and I think we're still waiting for a really big cut. But this is maybe a sign that Sundar and the rest of the Google leadership is looking for areas where there are redundancies and where they want to reduce those.
What about investors? How are they reacting to these steps?
So far, Google has been much more cautious than almost all the other big tech companies in cutting costs and especially cutting headcount. So I think there's a general sentiment among investors that the headcount at Google is too high. There was an activist hedge fund, TCI, that wrote a letter to that effect last month. And I spoke to other shareholders who basically felt like TCI was sort of saying the quiet part out loud. So I think what investors really want to see is a headcount reduction. And to be frank, that's just very un-Googly. So I think Sundar and the rest of Google leadership is grappling with whether and how they could ever do something like that.
All right, that's our reporter, Miles Kruppa. Thanks for joining us, Miles.
Thanks, Zoe.
And that's it for Tech News Briefing this week. Our producer is Julie Chang. We had editorial support from Philana Patterson. Our executive producer is Chris Sinsley. And I'm your host, Zoe Thomas. Thanks for listening and have a wonderful weekend.